Welcome everyone. For those who have just logged on, this is the Rural Workforce Innovation Network, otherwise known as ARWIN, Grant Workshop Part 2. We still have quite a few people still logging in yet, so we were going to give them a 1 or 2 more minutes before we get started. Welcome and thank you for attending the USDA Rural Development's Rural Workforce Innovation Network Grant Workshop. Hosted, and the platform is being hosted by our partners, the Interagency Working Group for Energy Communities. We are going to go ahead and get started. I know people are still logging in, but we do have a pretty full agenda today, so we want to get started. My name is Carol Watuski. I am the team lead with the Rural Workforce Innovation Network, otherwise known as ARWIN for short, and I'll also be your host today. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon for this workshop. Next slide. Today we'll have opening remarks from Briggs White of the Interagency Working Group. And then after that, we'll do an introduction of today's speakers who will present on tips for the application process and also around grants management. After the presentation, we have set aside time for the question and answer period, and then we'll wrap up with a short closing. Anytime during this workshop, please put your questions for the presenters in the chat box, and we will address them during that question and answer period. To find the chat box, if you look at the lower right-hand side of your screen, you see like a little conversation bubble, and if you click on it, it will open up a chat box for you. Again, I would like to say a special thank you to the Interagency Working Group for hosting today's platform. Next slide. To get us started today, I am honored to introduce Briggs White, PhD. Briggs White serves as Deputy Executive Director of the Biden administration's Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Revitalization. In this role, he works hand in hand with 11 federal agency members of the IWG to advance its mission. In the Interagency Working Group, otherwise known as IWG, is identifying and coordinating opportunities to connect energy communities for federal investments and to help ensure the shift to clean energy economy creates good paying union jobs, spurs economic revitalization, and remediates environmental degradation and supports energy workers in coal, oil and gas, and power plant communities. Prior to being appointed as the Deputy Executive Director, White was central to the multi-agency effort to prepare the IWG's initial report, which described existing mechanisms and provide recommendations for future actions that could support and revitalize the economies of energy communities. So with that, I will turn it over to Briggs White. Briggs?
Thanks, Carol. And I'd just like to start with a big thank you to USDA Rural Development for the great idea to put on a two-part series on grant writing. We heard from energy community stakeholders, which if you're not familiar, most energy communities are rural in nature, that the grant writing process gets burdensome both in the applications and in the management, as well as with the historic amount of infrastructure funding available. That can be a bit overwhelming, and it's hard to know exactly what's the right funding opportunity, and then once you figure it out, to go through the process of applying. So we just couldn't think of a better opportunity than what USDA was already working on, and so we were really happy to partner with them and thank them again for the flexibility. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the interagency working group and then leave most of the time to learn a little bit more about tips and tricks for applying for grants and managing them. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So in the first week of the presidency, the president established her executive order, the interagency working group, which includes 11 federal agencies plus OMB to bring a whole of government approach to supporting energy workers and energy communities that, for no fault of their own, find themselves on the wrong side of the energy transition. We really want to make sure that, in particular, we don't leave anyone behind. And so what that means is that we're being really thoughtful about collaborating with our agency partners to reduce the barriers to accessing federal funds, trying to make them move as fast as possible, but also being really thoughtful in terms of supporting communities, supporting workers to be able to access those funds through events such as this grant writing workshop. As was mentioned, we wrote an initial report to the president back 1 year ago, and we're actually celebrating Energy Communities Week this week. And since that year, we've learned a lot from stakeholders about barriers to accessing federal funds, and really are trying to be as targeted as possible to support them with a variety of different kinds of support mechanisms. Next slide, please. One of the key strategies laid out in the initial report was to provide some logistical focus. Recognizing that we can't be everywhere at the same time, we identified 25 priority energy communities to give us a logistical framework to focus our stakeholder outreach. And here what you see in the dark purple in particular are the top 25 communities based on the density of coal employment. And while not exactly, this does largely track to areas that have suffered some decline due to the coal industry. And additionally, I want to remark that there are other parts of the country, whether it's coal plants, which tend to be more distributed, as well as oil and gas communities. And we include those as all being communities within the interagency working group that we're focused on and that we want to hear from and we want to support if they find themselves in transition. Next slide, please. But in terms of federal funding, particularly with the infrastructure bill, there's a significant amount of opportunity. And some of the kinds of support that what we've heard from stakeholders and what's available is things like what you see on this slide. From upgrading infrastructure, we've heard that broadband is the closest thing that you can get to a silver bullet for supporting particularly remote communities that don't tend to have really robust broadband infrastructure, but also access to water infrastructure, roads, etc. Cleaning up environmental damage. Yes, as brownfields happen, as mine lands are abandoned, as coal plants shut down, those become properties, but also they become assets where we can leverage them for economic development, put workers to work, generate additional revenue in those communities. So a real strategy where we get a twofer, if you will, by improving the environment, but also creating economic development opportunities. Encouraging entrepreneurship in a lot of these communities as the power plants close down, as the coal mines close. It's a real impact on the tax base. And so as we think about diversification, looking for ideas where we can grow businesses that can generate revenue and provide that tax base to offset some of that decline. And then support workforce development, whether it's supporting workers to find another job or training or making sure that we have opportunities that align with existing training programs. Because what's the point of training if there isn't a job opportunity there? So a lot of different ways that we're trying to support energy workers and energy communities in these priority lanes. Next slide, please. And so this is my favorite slide because here what you see is if you take all of the funding opportunities federally that are available that are either targeted specifically to energy communities or are highly relevant to the needs of energy communities, you can see that there's currently over $200 billion worth of funding opportunities that are either open or being planned. And so 127 different opportunities can be a bit overwhelming. And so we created a clearinghouse at energycommunities.gov. I'll say that again, energycommunities.gov. And if you go to the website, you can click on the funding page and see the clearinghouse where there's a function where you can filter. So you can filter for example, all of the USDA funding opportunities that are available and that are relevant. You can find the Department of Energy ones, which of course with the infrastructure bill, $60 billion worth of energy programs under the infrastructure bill, many with specific call outs for energy communities, and a variety of other ones from our other agency partners. We also know that cost sharing is a real challenge, particularly in low capacity communities. So we've added in a filter that allows you to filter for which ones don't require cost share. You can see there's 52 opportunities without cost share. So some real opportunity. You still need to come up with cost share for a lot of the other ones. And I do want to point out that many of these flow through states as an intermediary. So some of these are competitive, where you would write a proposal directly to the federal government, to an agency. Other ones you would be working through a state as an intermediary, say, for example, Department of Interior's abandoned mine land reclamation program, or EPA water programs, et cetera. But there has been a significant amount of funding that has been invested to date, over $5.5 billion, of which USDA actually represents a significant fraction of that total. And there's more funding being awarded every day. Earlier this week, we had some coal community awards coming out of VDA with their $300 million coal communities commitment. So really a whole of government approach here on energycommunities.gov. Encourage you to check that out. Next slide, please. So as I conclude, a couple of calls to action. The first one is, please get engaged. Let us know what your challenges are, what your opportunities are. Check out energycommunities.gov. On the website, we also, in addition to the funding clearinghouse, we have an events page where you can find recordings of webinars like this one. And in fact, the first one in the series that we held last week with USDA, you can find a recording there under our events page. As well as you can find us on social media. There's the handles. And we just encourage you to connect with us on social, sign up on the website to get newsletters. We're sending out a newsletter about every other week these days, given the volume of funding opportunity updates. So you can, yes, check out the funding clearinghouse, but you can also just sign up to get an email in your inbox about every 2 or 3 weeks, and that'll give you an update on the various funding opportunities and other energy communities related things. Which again, if you're in a rural community, there's probably an energy community nearby since they tend to be pretty rural in nature. With that, I want to turn it back over to Carol and say again, big thank you to USDA, and thank you to all of our partners out there in the audience, and good luck with your grant writing and grant management.
Thank you. And today I'd like to introduce today's panel presenters. First off, we'll have Christine Kimball, who has been with the USDA Rural Development for the past 14 years. She works with our Rural Business and Cooperative Services Division and is a subject matter expert in grants and grants management. She has served on many different grant panels for multiple programs, including those internal and external to the USDA Rural Development. And then we will hear from Lou Torres, who is a member of the USDA Rural Development Innovation Center, the customer experience team. And Lou has 20 plus years of experience in the nonprofit sector, strategically managing federal grants. She is now with the USDA, experiencing the federal grant management side from the federal side. And Lou is very happy to be here with you today. So to get us started, I will now turn it over to Christine Kimball. Christine?
Good afternoon, everybody. As Carol said, I have many years of experience in reviewing grants and being on grants panels, not only for USDA, but also other federal agencies. And I'm going to kind of give you a peek behind the scenes of what a viewer's perspective is when they are reviewing grant applications. So this is probably a little bit different than some of the other grant application or grant processing webinars you may have experienced in the past. So Next slide, please. So I'm gonna present this in a way. We have a very large audience today, from all different fields and backgrounds, small businesses to large nonprofits and whatever. This is a very popular subject matter. So, everybody wants to get it right. There are so many opportunities to apply for federal funding, but it all boils down to packaging your application and packaging it properly. So I think providing a reviewer's perspective is going to give you some tips and tricks as far as how to accurately and succinctly put your application together for the review process. So the application package generally, regardless of agency, they're not uniform in everything that goes into an application package, but they usually consist of a couple of common denominators. The first being the Uniform Federal Application, which is called the SF 424. This is pretty much the document that identifies the program, the basics regarding how much the applicant is applying for, the match if applicable, and then the points of contact and the authorized person, the person authorized for the agency to submit this application. There will generally always be a narrative application package, and these correspond with the required components from the notice of funding. And the notice of funding has the proposal or the notification to the public that an application or application period is open can be called either a NOFA, which is notice of funding, a NOSA, which is a notice of solicitation or application of applications, or an RFA, which is a request for applications. They all pretty much mean the same thing. There are going to be other necessary federal forms. They're going to vary from program to program and from agency to agency, and the NOFA will spell that out, as well as any instructions that are provided on grants.gov. And then they'll also ask for supporting addenda. That can include things like verification of letters, but the notice of funding will outline what is required. Next slide, please. So this is what the SF 424 looks like. This is the document that's from grants.gov. It's just a quick snapshot summary of the program, the applicant, and like I said, the amount that's being applied for, and then any match required, and who the points of contact are. As a reviewer, what I will say is if there is conflicting information in the application package, if the narrative information differs from what's on this form as far as what the actual request for funding amount is, we will refer to the SF 424. So sometimes there are different teams that work on different pieces of a grant application. It could be one set of individuals works on the financials, and then another set of individuals works on the narrative, and then another set of individuals works on the forms. Or it could be a single person that's doing everything. This is the form that we refer to for accuracy. Next slide, please. So scoring ultimately decides who is awarded, and this is what you really want to nail. You want to nail the required sections. You don't want to give too much information. You don't want to give too little information, but ultimately competitive grants, it boils down to the score, and they're usually ranked and then selected until funding runs out. Applications are typically scored by a panel of individuals. Most of the applications, the grant panels that I've served on have 3 reviewers, and it's either a situation where the panel comes up with a consensus score or an average score from the 3 individuals. So it's always better to have multiple sets of eyes on a single application. And I want to set the stage for you. You know, some programs, there is a lot of applications that you have to review before you know, we convene and determine which ones are going to be awarded. So one reviewer might get 20 applications that they have to review within a 2 or 3 week period, and some applications can be 200 or 300 pages long. So I wanted to give this snapshot behind the scenes, because as a reviewer, sometimes there's information that's erroneous that doesn't need to be in there. Sometimes there's information that's missing. And as a reviewer, you're trying your best to catch everything that's needed, but sometimes when there's information that is erroneous, you know, it can be missed. So that's another reason for more than one set of eyes. Scoring elements are usually provided for in the notice of funding. So when you look at the NOFA, sometimes it will tell you how much each section, you know, what the score for that particular section will be. And a low score does not mean that a project does not have merit. An application could be for a fabulous project, but there could be points left on the table because something wasn't clear or clarified. And we're going to get into some of those sections next. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is what a sample notice of funding looks like. And this notice of funding is actually from one of Rural Development's programs, and it's 8 pages long, and it's very daunting, and the writing is very small, and it looks like something, you know, that, oh my God, you know, that's a lot of reading to do. But this document is your best friend. Most federal agencies on their website have created summaries of their programs, or summaries of, you know, an open application, and it might be 2 or 3 pages. It's easier reading. It puts everything into bullet points. I would recommend strongly that, you know, even though this looks daunting and some of this information could be repetitive, I would take out a microscope or a magnifying glass and take notes and read every single word, because as this section that is highlighted here, you know, this particular program indicates the scoring criteria. And if you read each section, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, they're telling you what needs to be in those areas, and what the weight or the score given for that section would be. And those summaries don't always contain this information. And there could be nuances. There could be, you know, a sentence that, you know, describes something that's eligible for the program or the project. So this really is your best friend. And I would definitely take a notebook and highlight and make comments, and, you know, and then maybe refer to the summary document, you know, as an aid. But anyway, yeah, I cannot emphasize, you know, enough times how important reading through this entire NOFA is. Next slide, please. So I would say virtually every grant application package that I've ever reviewed has an executive summary. It's usually a 1-pager. It's a quick snapshot of the project in a narrative form. It should contain the meat and potatoes of the project, such as why the project is eligible. Is the project, you know, is the applicant eligible? Why the project itself is eligible? The timeline for the project. Is it a 1-year project? Is it a 3-year project? But it's a real quick snapshot. And the reviewer typically refers back to this many times throughout their process, their review process. It's really important to have this really quick document that you can refer to, and then go and evaluate and reevaluate the other sections. Next slide, please. So the scope of work is an expanded version, of course, of the executive summary. So then you get into a more detailed explanation and description of the applicant, why they're eligible, why the project is eligible, what the use of funds are, why the use of funds is eligible. And this should all refer back to parts of the NOFA. You want to make sure that what you write in your narrative is compatible with what the NOFA says is required of the applicant, in order to compete for these funds. There should be some background information included for the project, but not too much. I've seen applications that go on for pages and pages of historical information and statistics and things like that. And sometimes that uses up a lot of pages. And, as a reviewer, you start getting tired when you're reading documents that don't always fit in with what you're trying to score. So you want to try to, provide a little bit of information, but not so much that, you're reading many, many, many pages that aren't relevant to the scoring. Because as a scorer, I'm usually going, I read it one time typically to get a feel for the project, and then I start narrowing in, or zeroing in on the pieces of the project that you want to score, that I want to score. And there are some programs that have page limits. There are some programs that have word limits. There are some programs that have a specific font that they want to see and margins. And I have seen some applications that have come in where the narrative is all a single paragraph on a page because they're trying to make the font small, to meet a word limit requirement. And believe me, that is a hard thing for a reviewer to do. And you're really not doing yourselves any service by doing that, because there are things that could be missed if they're relevant to the scoring. The scope of work should describe the benefits, obviously, the beneficiaries of the project and why, this project is, should be considered for this funding. And if there is statistical data that's required, sometimes I've reviewed projects that didn't have citations regarding, population or demographics. They didn't cite where it came from. And that could be problematic in scoring, especially if statistics are a requirement in the scoring criteria. So citations are very important. Sometimes they come from different sources. They're not always census. They could be labor data. They could be from EPA, but you should definitely cite your resources for statistical data. Next page, please. So this is a very, very important section. And this section, the task list and timeline, work in conjunction with the budget. Now, I have read some incredible projects over the years, and this section and the next section, which is the budget, are sometimes there's not enough information that is provided to render a score. And as a reviewer, when you start looking at, you're on your fourth or your fifth or your sixth or your seventh application, you start to identify which applicants have provided this information in the best, easiest format, and easy to understand, and those not as well. And so, it might necessitate going back and rescoring an earlier application. But I can tell you, this is so important. The task list and timeline represent the chronology of the project. So basically, if this is a 3-year project, what is going to happen in the first quarter? What's going to happen in the first month? I mean, depending on the length and how you want to present this information, it's going to be from the start of the project to the finish of the project. It should provide during this timeline objectives and goals and what the deliverables are in each section of this timeline and task list. It names who the primary individuals are who are responsible for each task. And, this information can be presented as a chart or a narrative. Next slide, please. So I've provided an example from an actual application that I reviewed, and this one is very simple. This one has a column for the required activity, it has a column for the responsible party, and it has a column for the proposed timeline. Now, this particular application was provided, this piece was provided in a template form, but not all programs or agencies will provide a template for you to work in. That, templates are the easiest, but they're not always provided. This one is very simple. It's a 1-year project. They've indicated what the activity is and when that particular activity is going to occur, and then who the responsible parties are. Now, because this is a very simple program, the kind of detail that I would expect to see in a more complex project, is not demonstrated here. There are some applications that I've reviewed for, 3-year projects that are for $500,000. You really want to get into the nitty-gritty. You want to name names. You want to indicate, a more refined timeline, and then what's going to happen, and at some point, what the results of that activity are. So, and that ties into a conversation we're going to have shortly with Lou. As a reviewer, we're looking also at this as how is the side of this. If awarded, the servicer is going to use this as their roadmap for, reviewing reports and are benchmarks being met, and, are things in line with how the project was proposed. So this is a very important piece. Next slide, please. And so the budget, which ties in with the task list and timeline, is probably the most problematic area that I see in the applications that I've reviewed. And this is across the board, regardless of program, grant amount, agency, or whatever. The budget is so important because it typically represents a fairly significant percentage or number of points in the score. And the budget needs to be presented in such a way that if the grant is awarded, that on the servicing side, they can follow that the funds are being spent in accordance with, how it was proposed, that things are, it enables you to keep, to keep track of how match is being spent, if a match is required. And it's really important that the budget is substantiated. So I'll give you we'll look at some examples here shortly. But anything, typically, rule of thumb is if there's a cost greater than $5,000, it needs to be described and explained. And that would be for things like travel expenses or supplies. I have seen a lot of applications where there's a lot of round numbers that are used, like $10,000 for supplies, but no explanation as to what that represents. And then you go back and look at the task list and timeline, and you don't see a justification based on what's in there for why there should be $10,000 worth of supplies. So this is what I mean when I say they work in concert with each other. There should be calculations or formulas provided for personnel expenses, because with a lot of applications and a lot of proposals, personnel, especially for technical assistance type applications, personnel are the largest expenses. So you could have 5 people that are part of the team, and sometimes I see applications that'll just lump like a $50,000 for 5 people for 1 year or whatever, but there's no calculation as to what that represents. The other thing too is the budget should show when match is going to be applied or spent, throughout the period of the project. Next slide, please. So I've provided 3 sample budgets, a pretty simple one, one that's a little more complex, and then one that's very complex. And these are just pieces of the budget, to be honest with you. I mean, they're not even, some budgets can go on for pages and pages, but I'm trying to make the point in terms of how they should be structured and the information that should be identified. So this was an actual application that I looked at, and I've taken out anything that's identifiable. So there's nothing in this that's identifiable. So it shows, what the task is, what the start date and the finish date is, and the funds that are going to be used for that particular item, and then, how that compares to the total project cost. If there were supplemental funds, so this was a template that was provided for this particular program, but you can see that everything is, they've itemized, they've integrated some of the tasks from the prior section into this budget. And that's really important because that saves a lot of time for a reviewer, to have to bounce back and forth, and it clarifies things. It makes things pretty clear. So you can see by this example, there was a little bit of match that's going to be provided, and it's going to be provided for task number 6, but we reached the total, the reward, the project ask, which is 19,605, the match that's being provided, and then the total project cost, is 20,887.63. So this is a very easy peasy, not a whole lot of complexity to this. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this is one that I would call somewhere in the middle. And this particular budget was several pages long. And this just happened to be, I picked up this because I'm trying to illustrate the necessity for providing formulas. For example, we highlighted this section, graphic design services, 50 hours at $100 an hour. So they have justified that amount request for $5,000 for this particular piece, and they're explaining what that's going to be used for. If you look down at 6B, the item directly beneath that, that is for consultants, 100 hours at $100 an hour for $10,000. And then again, it's telling you what the purpose of that is. So this is a fairly easy application to read from, a reviewer's perspective. Sometimes we have calculators, we calculate these things to make sure that everything is added up correctly. And, this is a really good example of a project that's a little more complex than the previous one. Next slide, please. This one is significantly more complex than the previous one. And this one was also several pages long. So I just cut out this piece to demonstrate the kind of detail that, some applicants provide versus other, which just makes it, this is like a no-brainer as far as, did the applicant adequately support the budget, the budget and the amount that they're requesting for. I mean, if you look at the narrative descriptions, they've not only provided hourly rates and billable hours, they've gotten down to outreach materials and the cost of flyers, delivery prep and cleanup for this is a really good quality budget. So this particular applicant would have scored significantly higher on this one than somebody who was competing for the same money that didn't provide this level of detail. Next slide, please. So the qualifications of the applicant. This is really important and ties into that task list and timeline. So what we're looking for generally is that who is performing or who is involved in the project has the adequate qualifications, to provide the technical assistance, to manage the project. If it's not a technical assistance, somebody has to manage the project. And then also we're looking to make sure that the entity has, the ability to manage a federal grant. So that's typically something we're looking for from organizations and entities. Now, if it's the type of program that provides funding directly to small businesses or ag producers, or obviously we're not looking for that kind of managerial expertise, but for organizations, we want to make sure that there's a lot of strings attached to federal funding. It's not like Matthew Lesko, the guy from the 90s that used to sell those books and those videotapes about how easy it was to get a federal grant. It's not like that. It's not like you're awarded, we write you a check and send you on your way. There are a lot of strings attached. There are there are deliverables, there are benchmarks, there are we have to verify. Funds are usually requested after they've already been spent. They're usually based on a reimbursement. So these things that are in this application package are tools for the folks on the back end to verify that everything is happening in accordance with schedule and what the proposal said. So qualifications and experience should tie into the task list and timeline. So I've seen applications where individuals are named who are going to be the leads, and then their qualifications have been provided and they don't tie in at all to what the project is. So it's really important that whoever, like if somebody is doing something extremely technical, that they have the background to support that function. So that's really important. And sometimes an agency wants to see resumes, and sometimes it's okay to embed it in the narrative, but the reviewer will be looking at that and making sure that there are qualified individuals that are going to be performing those tasks. And one other tip: if there are some projects that funds are going to be used to hire individuals to do those tasks. So if you don't have anybody hired, obviously you don't have any resumes. But what you do want to provide is a description of the minimum qualifications that you're looking for when you fill that spot. If you're awarded those grant funds, that is extremely important, because qualifications, they play a key role in ensuring that program funds are being adequately and accurately delivered to the communities or whomever is going to benefit from them. So yeah, that's a little tip. If you're going to hire, make sure you indicate what the minimum qualifications are. Next slide, please. There's addenda. So basically what we covered earlier is meat and potatoes: your executive summary, your scope of work, your task list and timeline, and your budget. Now, there are so many programs out there. Additional information could be things like verification of match, if it's to purchase equipment or it's going to be something highly technical, cutout sheets of what's going to be purchased, or highly technical schematics or whatever for infrastructure projects or things like that. So I consider those the addenda because they're away from the core elements that we just went over. So addenda could also include resumes of key personnel, letters of support. Now, letters of support could be coming from community entities or partners. I mean, that's all going to be covered in the NOFA. Again, the NOFA is your friend. It's going to tell you what you need. If the NOFA or the program wants to see letters of support, try to get as many as you can, as long as you don't exceed, the amount that's stated in the NOFA. Like, it's not going to get you any more points. I've seen applications where they limit to maybe 5 letters of support and 20 come in. Well, 20 doesn't really help if, you're limited to 5. So we're trying to save you time as well as, our time in going through all of this other information. Other addenda could include organizational information like certificate of good standing, financials. There could be other things like project location. That's another thing. Some programs want to see where the project is going to be located. And if you'll go to the next slide. This is an example of a project location that, for one of the applications that I reviewed. It's, map. It shows exactly, it highlights where the project is going to be located. And so anyway, these are all part of the scoring, and the easier it is for somebody reviewing. And I will tell you this, if I've reviewed 20 applications and I've got one more to go, I'm probably not as fresh on the 21st, but I don't want to, I don't want to shortchange anybody. I'll go back and review, and it's not unusual for a score to go back and tweak, especially as, as they've gone through, so many other previous applications, and you tend to mentally determine which one had the most clearly articulated of what you were looking for, that followed the parameters of the program, and then you mentally rank them, and then you get together with your other panel members, and you either come up with a the same score, and you discuss and you point things out, or you do an average score. So I'm not saying that happens with every federal program, but I think it's safe to say that that's fairly common with most of them, this process. And next slide, please. So that includes my tips and tricks from a reviewer's perspective, and we'll turn it back to Carol.
Thank you, Christine, for all that information and the tips and suggestions. If you have questions for Christine, please continue to enter them in the chat. We are collecting them for the question and answer period that we'll be addressing your questions with her at that time. Next, I'm happy to turn it over to Lou Torres with USDA Rural Development Innovation Center. Lou?
Thanks, Carol. So as we get started today, I just would like to invite you to put any ideas or tips that you have in the chat box. I love learning new tips, especially about grant management. Like Carol said, I've been doing this 20 plus years. I think I was this morning trying to count about 33 federal grants I've had the opportunity to manage, and as a consultant working with several organizations. And one thing I just wanted to share is that I would go into these organizations and I'd say, well, where's your grant team? Well, here's our grant writer. Well, where's your grant team? And what I'd like to stress here is that this money is really, really important to your organization. Make sure that you put that much importance into your grant management team. So with that being said, today, what we're really going to cover is risk management, translating a proposal into a program plan. What's that look like? Managing and administering a subaward, if perchance your federal grant has a subaward. Managing budgets and finances, keeping records and documentation, monitoring and continuous review, reporting and closeout. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with managing risk. Next slide. So managing risk is really about addressing anything that could be a future event that would force your organization to change the way they do business. And so you really want to make sure that you figure out ahead of time if your organization is ready to prepare and to manage risk. But there's some easy steps that your organization can take to really prepare for those risks, even taking on a potential high risk grant. So one idea to think about before applying for the grant: could this grant be high risk for organization? Build some organizational capacity statements. Do we have the money? If this is a reimbursement grant, can we put the cash up first? Do we have enough staffing? Do we have enough needed equipment if it doesn't let me buy any new equipment? Or are we developing goals that we can actually obtain? And finally, like I said, is it a reimbursement grant? Do we have that cash flow in our overhead until reimbursed? And with this additional grant, is it going to push us into a single audit? And that's where cumulatively your federal grants add up to a point where you have to do a single audit, which they're more expensive than a regular audit. And so build those capacity questions. And if you answer no to all of them, you might want to step back and say, maybe this grant's not for us. But if you say no to some and yes to some, and you'll say, we still want to manage this grant, we want to apply for this grant, then figure out how can you change your cash flow. If cash flow is a problem, do we have enough needed equipment? Can we get that equipment donated? So there's ways to really build a plan if you want to go ahead and apply for a grant that's maybe a little bit higher risk for your organization. And you really want to think about, if this grant goes south, if we can't manage it, how will it affect the rest of our organization? So just think about that. And it's okay to say, wow, it's a big high risk, but it's something we really want to do. We think we're ready for it. Just plan for it. Think about what kinds of things could happen and plan for it. I think too, part of risk management is training your staff. Make sure all your staff, if you get this grant, make sure that they're trained on the deliverables, the timelines, the budgets. Be sure that you have a really strong communication plan to include all your staff, not just the few that may be in the grant deliverable area, but if all your staff know what's going on and they understand your cash flow with it, they could have a great perspective to offer some ideas, but also they can understand what's going on when cash flow might get tight, or there's a lot of information, a lot of energy putting towards a deliverable with a deadline coming up. And then build into your job descriptions, be a member of a grant team. Many times I've heard, well, that's not in my job description. Well, it can be now. Just go ahead and think about that. As duties required, we'll just talk about helping support grants when asked, helping support grant management when asked. That's really important. So really the two key takeaways for risk management is planning ahead, training your staff, and communicating to your staff everything that's going on around your grants. So communication, next slide, please. We just talked about communication a little bit. Make sure that you're communicating, and where it becomes a little bit complex, if you have multiple federal grants, you can still build that plan, and we're going to talk about translating the grant into a plan. You can still build a plan with several of your one or two or more. I've worked with one organization that had 7 federal grants that we just built a very large Excel spreadsheet with all the grants, the deliverables, the timelines, who was in charge, resources needed. And it was a part of our standing agenda at our staff meeting. Every week at the staff meeting, we talked about that timeline to make sure that we were on track, and that if something started happening, we could see it ahead of time and manage it before it became a disaster or a high risk to the organization. So remember, communication is really key to a lot of parts of our organization. So translating a proposal into a program plan. Okay, you've applied for the grant, you've accepted the kind of risk that you're going to want to take, you're ready for it, you apply for it, and voila, you get the grant. And so take that information like that task list and timeline that Christine was talking about early, turn that into a work plan, okay? Take that information about your deliverables and your times. Who's going to be the champion for that? Who's going to manage the budget? I like to have two eyes on the budget. So budgets are just so integral to the success. What tools or resources are you going to need? And then here's a part, where's your regulatory compliance come in? What regulations do you have to follow? And I'm going to be talking about some regulations later on, but had made some copies and some PDFs to be sent out to you of the regs that are really around federal grant compliance. So I hope you get those and take a look at those. But this plan is detailed. It talks about, when we're going to be, our deliverable is, if we need to get something done by February 2nd, and what the steps up to February 2nd. We don't wait till that February 1st to worry if it's done, but you need to build in those steps and who's involved. It may be building partnerships. It may be putting a curriculum together. So there's a lot of those components, those detailed components need to be into that plan. And then also how to measure outcomes. How are you going to determine that you have met or exceeded that outcome? And your milestones, those little benchmarks as you get along the way, how do you measure that you're there? And make sure that when you're developing those in your plan, that, if we're going to start teaching a class to elementary school, well, we've got to develop the curriculum, back in November. Well, how do we measure that when it's complete? Who signs off on that? Make sure that's really clear, and make sure that it's a yes or no. Did it happen? Did it not happen? When it's gray, that's kind of hard to keep moving ahead. But use your grant application, your proposal, your budget. Make sure your budget's involved with your grant plan. You want to discuss that. You don't want to overspend, and you do not want to buy things that are not allowable within this grant by accident. Next slide, please. Now you have your plan, use it. Don't make a really great, gorgeous plan and then not use it. And I've seen that happen over the years. It's a beautiful plan. It's even been put in a binder, and it just sits on a bookshelf, or it's a ledge. It's something for the monitor to sit on. So get it out, use it, and make sure that you bring it to your weekly staff meetings. So just in case you get a grant that you have a subawardee, meaning that you're going to give somebody else some money to help with your deliverables. So your grant may include a subaward, okay? When this has occurred, it isn't just like I'm gonna write them a check and they're gonna do it and come back with the deliverables and I get to put that on my report. It doesn't really work that way. So you need to decide in your organization who's gonna be the liaison to work with this subawardee. It's really, really important. What's the communication plan? How often are you gonna talk? And the compliance issues. Your subawardee is accountable for the same compliance issues that you are. So make sure that those are well communicated with to your subawardee, and check on them. You see how they're doing. Are they still in compliance? So the first step when you're thinking about a subawardee is the federal grant dollars are involved. You need to determine whether the engagement is an outside entity. It really constitutes a subaward, or it may be a vendor. If it's just a purchase, it might be a vendor. And so the OMB Circular A87 and A133, and these are what I've sent copies for, really define that and really help you define that. And like Christine said, get that magnifier out, really look at that. I go through, when I go through the NOFA, I have my highlighters, and I'm highlighting where's my risk and where's my critical. Well, I go through these OMB circulars when it comes to grant compliance, and I put little Post-its in the sidelines so I can find the page quickly. It's all highlighted. Go through and then make sure that your subawardee knows that, because you want to stay really transparent on your decision, how you find your subawardee. You want to make sure that they understand how they can spend the money and how they cannot spend the money. So it's really, really important that you determine this with your sub-awardee and meet with them on a regular basis. I cannot emphasize that enough. And once again, the difference between a sub-awardee and a vendor, they're not held to this compliance level. You purchase something from them that's already been pre-approved in your budget, but this sub-awardee is getting a check from you to accomplish a certain part of the deliverable within your grant. And like I said, they are held to same compliance, but it's your responsibility to make sure that that's happening. And when I've had federal grants with sub-awardees, I had a Monday morning meeting every Monday morning with our sub-awardee. No matter how busy we got, we made sure that we met someplace and went over everything that had happened the previous week, money that was spent, what was going to happen this week, and what dollars were going to be spent. I asked for copies of receipts, and there was a little template that we made just for them to fill out what they had done and accomplished. And sometimes I needed to see it. You know, if we were having a site built, I wanted to go see it, or something put onto a site, I needed to go see it. So really take it very seriously. It's not just somebody else making sure deliverables are getting done. And then document it. Document your meetings, document everything so that in your communications, so when it's time for your quarterly report, your reimbursement report, you can get that money back and there's not any concerns that you're not managing your sub-awardee. Next slide, please. So managing your budget. And like Christine said, this is just huge. Making sure you build your budget correctly. Now you have to manage it correctly. And you really need to employ sound financial management practices and make effective use of the funds and provide for accurate, complete, and current disclosure and documentation of financial spending throughout the term of the grant. And I can't say that hard enough, strong enough, that you just don't want a federal forensic auditor to show up and go through your books, because they will audit you down to the penny. And so, it's stressful, but just make sure that be proactive than have to be reactive with your budget and finance. But make sure that before it's expended, the money's, if you're going to go out and buy a laptop, make sure that that laptop is mentioned in your budget. It said right here, I can buy a laptop for $1,800. All right. And make sure that that's there, because you don't want to go out and think, well, I think it said it, but I'm here, I'm going to get it and go back. And if it's not, it won't be covered. And have someone that's strong in accounting, manage it, and do a financial presentation at every staff meeting when you're having your grant overview. Talk about the money that's being spent. Have your grants receivables. Have you gotten your previous reimbursements if it's a reimbursement grant? But make sure that talking about your finances is always on the top of your grant management conversations and communications. Some people say, well, the budget's just an idea or a guideline. No, it's really a roadmap. And if you take a wrong turn, it's not a happy day. You'll have nothing but problems. Okay. And if your budget starts to you start spending a little bit too much money, or you see, you had projected that your laptop was going to cost $1,800, but now that laptop's going to cost $2,400. Call your program manager at your federal agency that you're working with. Call them and talk to them. Make them your best friend. I've learned that many years ago. Be proactive and call them saying, hey, we projected $1,800. Now it's $2,400. Please advise me. And then I'd follow up with an email so that I get it back in writing, and I'd add that communication to our doc grants, our documentation for our grant reporting. And the NOFA will let you know how to spend the money, what you can spend it on, but make sure you really, really follow that. And like I said, small adjustments you can make, but those larger adjustments, you really need to talk to your grant manager with the federal agency and find out exactly when they want to know about it. And usually they say, well, it's 10%. I remember at 4 and 5%, I would call and just give them a heads up. And the cost principles back in the OMB circular A87 really helps you determine cost matching, allowable costs, and your indirect costs. And it's really important to make sure that your cost matching gets booked properly. I've seen several organizations have the match dollars, but then when it came to booking it, they didn't book it correctly, so they didn't get credit for it. And it took us a lot of work, a lot of communication and time to go back and show our federal agency grant manager, program manager, that yes, the match was made, it was a booking error. And so really make sure, have 2 eyes on it so that you don't make those kinds of mistakes, because there's a lot of red flags if you don't report your finances correctly and accurately and on time. Next slide. So keeping records and documentation, and this is something that takes you back to the beginning of your grant team. Make sure that you set this stuff up early, whether it's your hard files or it's everything's electronic. Make sure it's clear, have a naming convention so that your grant award is there, any grant amendments, your original grant application, documents from your subawards, your subgrantees, your subawards, program budgets, all expenditures. I even learned to scan and copy some of the receipts because some of that thermal paper, by the time you get an audit, they've disappeared. They've faded. And we had to go back, and it was a lot of work to go back and try to track down those spendings. But and then make sure that in the OMB circular with your agency, you find out how long you need to retain those organizational documents. But if you take the time to set this up, your records and your documentation, set all the files up, work with your grant team that you all use the same naming convention, I guarantee you that your grant management experience will be a lot more fun, and it'll be proactive as opposed to reactive and always trying to do catch-ups. That gets to be a little bit stressful, and it kind of starts showing up on other parts of your organization. Have your filing system extremely organized. Communicate with the staff, the system, so they understand it. And just by being organized in the front, you're going to save so much time and frustration at the end. And that has been learned by years of experience. I can say that. Next slide, please. So monitoring and continuous review. This is really, really important. And it goes back to being when we talked about having your grant management on a standing agenda for your staff meetings. Review your grant calendar, build your grant calendar out of all your deadlines, color code it for different types of grants. If you have 4 grants, assign 4 colors. And you can see anytime there's a deadline, if it's red, it must be a USDA grant. If it's yellow, it's an SBA grant. You know, set that up so that you can see that. Have your regular meetings. I always like to put them with my staff meetings just because I knew that they were on the calendar. And build your performance matrix. Make sure that that plan we talked about in the very beginning, have that plan on the table and be able to write on it and make notes and keep it up to date, but make sure it's there and make sure that you're where you're at, and don't be afraid to say, hey, we didn't meet our measurables this week. We need to stop and think about that, and how as a team can we get back on task? And it goes back to communication, excuse me. Communication, I cannot say enough about. If you start holding it tight, if something kind of, you're not meeting a deadline and you hold it tight trying to catch up by yourself, that just causes a lot more stress and frustration, and it starts filtering out to the rest of your organization. Just talk it, put it out on the table. Call your program manager. I remember some of my grants, it was Monday, I called her. I had her on speed dial. because it was a complicated grant. I inherited a grant that was a little complicated, and we spent a lot of time together, but in the end, it turned out great. When we did our final closeout, we balanced to the penny, and we all celebrated. And I have been with organizations where that wasn't the outcome because things had not been done properly. And next grant, please. Next slide, please. So reporting, once again, make sure your reports are on time. If they, calendar that, put it on your grant calendar. And I always put it a day ahead of time. It's just like my grant application. I never waited until the deadline date because seriously, one night I'm applying for a grant and we lost power. We had a thunderstorm come through the valley and we lost power and I didn't get to apply for the grant. And it was really frustrating. Make sure they're on time and accurate. Have somebody else look at your numbers. And, like Christine said about the erroneous information, pull that out. They want to know what the deliverables, what have you done? How close are your deliverables? Really, and even go back to your program manager and say, give me a format. What do you want to see? Get an outline form, and I'll make sure that those are there. But accurately report what's going on and on time. And then you drop that file into your calendar and make sure that your budget matches what you said that your deliverables are. That's, once again, it's really important. What Christine, I cannot reiterate how spot on she is when that narrative has to match the money. They have to play really, really well together and tight. So work with your accountant or the person managing your finances and your program person that's working on the deliverables and make sure those are working really well together, because you'll get a pushback. And I have worked with organizations that didn't get it on time and wasn't accurate and literally got 4 quarters behind in their cash flow. And it just starts like a snowball. It starts getting larger and larger and larger and really hard to manage. And so it's real easy. When you get your grant award, you will have your dates that those reports are due. Calendar it. And you can stop the day to make sure that that report gets in on time. Next slide. Closing out your grant. Closing out your grant is just as important to getting your grant. Don't leave it out there dangling. And there's in 2 CFR 200, the requirements are all outlined. And essentially, all the federal grants I've ever worked with have 90 days at the end of your grant. You must be closed out. You have to have all your reports in, finalize your budget, and make sure you follow that, because you want to stay in really good communications with your federal grant agencies. Because if you want future grants, it's really important to make sure that the grants you're managing today are doing really well. But take time to read those. Some grants, go back, to your grant awards. Some grants may have a little bit of a nuance to close them out, but make sure that you follow those timelines and everything that it says. And it's if you wait till the very end to close out your grant late and you haven't kept your record, it's like wrangling data, having staff search through their emails or looking for documents. Just go back and get everything really organized in the very front end, and you will have a good time managing your grants. I always say you can sleep at night because you know everything's ready. And with that, Carol, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lou, for that presentation and all that information and sharing your expertise and experience of working with grants. I would like to invite Lou and Christine and Briggs back to this. And this is a question and answer panel that we're going to ask out here and start sharing some of the questions that you have put together in the chat panel. So we'll go ahead and I'll kind of rotate them amongst our speakers here. And to get us started, Christine, there's a question about, is there a rubric, a federal rubric around the scoring, or, some kind of rubric around federal grant scoring?
No, And because every program and every agency has different scoring parameters, there's nothing that's uniform. I mean, even within RD, we have so many different programs, and none of them are identical. Some of them might follow a similar pattern, but they're definitely not identical. And the ones that I've seen outside of rural development and with some of the other agencies, there's no conformity to how we evaluate, under the RD program. So um, I'm not, that's why the NOFA is what describes, the weight of the score itself. It, and I can't say for certain that every single program, that every federal agency, when they publish their NOFA, that they include it, but most do. They're telling you exactly what the weight of importance is in what's being scored and evaluated. But, not every agency places the same emphasis universally on what's presented. Like, there are some, I've seen some highly, highly technical grants for like infrastructure projects that, are just way beyond my head, where the emphasis is on the technology. You know what I mean? So no, there's no uniformity.
Thank you. And Lou, a question for you. What are some resources for all the panelists and different ones? And we'll start out with you, Lou. What other resources do panelists suggest for nonprofits that have never applied for federal grants but want to build their capacity? And along those same line, what are some tips for finding grant writing consultants if the nonprofit doesn't have anyone on their staff with that capability or skill set?
Okay, let's see. First of all, for writing those grants, there's a couple of good classes out there. But go to your local junior college. They have some great classes, and they're a little bit more affordable. The Grant Writers Association and Professional Grant Writers, they have some grant writers sometimes, and some of them do some pro bono or reduced prices for lower capacity. I mean, little nonprofits that are just starting. And to build your first federal grant, it goes back to that application. It's really, I'll be honest, it's very difficult to get in that first one. And so make sure that your application is perfect. I remember my very first grant, federal grant, I had my board of directors, a couple of people on my board, to actually go through and edit my budget, make sure my budget was good, my narrative was good, my critical need statement, the deliverables, and we really took a lot of time to manage it. And now that I see more grants currently, they're asking for staff experience. And when they talk about your skill sets of whether you have the skills to, whether it's broadband deployment or curriculum development, also talk about that you have a grants management team. You have a grants management team in place that'll be managing this team. And even if it's your board members, put their credentials. If you have a CPA on your board, he or she will be oversight of the budget. That gives the scoring team, and I've been on peer scoring teams before, that it gives you a little bit more confidence that if they were given this money, they would do a good job. And second, I would say look for those smaller grants, not the big $500,000 or $1 million grants, or the ones that are high technology, like Christine was just talking about. Look at some of your lower federal grants. And there's a couple I know that we have. We have an RBDG. Start with that one if it can apply for, but look for those smaller grants that are smaller dollars, $50,000 or $60,000, smaller grants. And then you can say you had experience managing successful experience managing the federal grant.
Can I
Thank
chime
you.
in?
Yes, other side, please.
Just want to chime in. If you have relationships with some of your peer organizations that have successfully received grants, they would be a great resource to kind of walk you through the process, or potentially provide leads for grant writing consultants or that kind of thing. And depending on the nature of your organization, you might be able to get some assistance from a local CDC. So I would definitely check though with peer organizations first.
And Briggs, do you have any suggestions for them?
Yeah, I was just going to say, the last comment was really good, and I was going to remark that there are sometimes federally funded communities of practice which can offer that peer support within a bit of structure. Also, there are technical assistance grants that can be received, usually with a much smaller barrier to entry, where maybe you only have to write a couple of pages or something, but not nearly as challenging in terms of writing the proposal. And while the technical assistance can't write the grant for you, it can really help you think your way through the planning, which is going to provide the foundation for when you go to write the proposal. So, I think everybody said sort of have a coalition, have a team. They can give you that peer-reviewed feedback. Also talk in your peer network about what works and accessing those resources. I'd point out that like philanthropy frequently can be helpful, and if you don't know philanthropy, maybe one of your peers has a connection with somebody in philanthropy, and then they can either fund the grant writing resource or connect you with somebody that can help you, perhaps in a high capacity anchor institution like, maybe a university or an NGO that wants to help out with low capacity organizations. So I think the networking is really important, and just totally want to double down on what the previous speaker said.
Thank you. I have a question that came up here, and it has to do with when you have somebody doing grant writing for you and you hire, and when they're completing the SF 424 on behalf as part of the grant application, do they sign it as a representative, or does somebody from the organization itself have to be the one that signs that for SF 424 grant application?
The organization. A second party cannot sign, or third party cannot sign that. That SF 424 is coming from the representative, the applicant. So it can only be the applicant that signs that document. Because that person that's doing the grant, the consultant is not going to be there at the end either. They're not going to be there when this thing's being serviced. So you need your point of contact within the organization, if it's awarded, be identified.
Thank you. And this is for everybody, for grants management also, but on the application, do all expenses need to be predicted in order for the purchase to be allowed? How do you figure out, the expenses, your equipment but your supplies, predicting it ahead of time, and then determining what's allowed after you receive the grant?
I can take that. You're estimating to the best of your ability, and it's natural for there to be some variations along the way. If something is off a little bit, it's typically not problematic. But as Lou said, this is a good time to reach out to your partner at the federal agency and say, look, I thought it was going to be this, but it's going to be this. Is that okay? And typically it is. And a lot of times, if it's more than, typically 10% is kind of the threshold where it's not problematic. A 10% difference in that section of the budget. Okay. But yeah, reach out to whoever you're working with at the federal agency, and it's usually a no-brainer. I mean, I serviced grants all in the past as well, and it was, I would say, easily half had some kind of tweak between the time the grant was awarded and the time that it closed out. And sometimes it was significant, enough that it had to be documented, in writing and, taken up the chain. Basically, what we're looking for is there is no material change in the essence of the project, or there is no diversion of funds, from one item to something, to something completely different. So that's what we're trying to maintain. But, I've run into situations also where, as the application, or I'm sorry, as the award progressed and it was 6 months into it, there was a change in circumstances. And, those are not unheard of either. If the award is going to veer off course, that might be a good time, for everybody to get to the table and then figure out what can remedy that. Obviously you don't want good work halted, so there could be an alternative that everybody could come up with collectively. But it is not usual for funds to shift a little bit from one pocket or one, something that was anticipated or expected up front, and have that changed, minimally.
Oh, you're on mute.
Over my 20 years of managing grants, Carol, I've never ever had a project manager, and I got to know them really well, be upset that I called, even if it was less than a 10%. They were always appreciative. And like they said, there were no surprises. They were ready when those reports came in for that adjustment, and we're very appreciative. So it's about that communication.
Okay, and then we're going to take time for one more question. There's a lot of great questions coming in, and we're trying to we'll try to capture and try to do responses as best as we can with all the information that we have here. But to wrap up the question is, when you have multiple grant projects or you have multiple grants to a project to administer, what are some best practices to keeping that all on track? And I'll start with you, Lou.
Carol, in the past, I built a spreadsheet, and then there is some software out there that you can do that. It's very, very expensive, but I built a spreadsheet. I keep all my federal grants, the deliverables, the dates, the times, the resources. I color code them. I love color coding things. And once again, back at my staff meeting, every week we talked about them. We made sure they were straight. I had different project managers for each grant. And so I'd meet with them on one-on-one, and we'd meet together at the staff. We'd meet together as a team, a lot of meetings. But when that money is integral to your organizations moving forward with their programs, that time is worth it.
Thank you. Christine, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, thank you. So we're getting towards the end here because we do want to let everybody go on time today. So to wrap things up, I'm just going to reach back out to each one of the panelists to ask them to share one or two things really quickly, really briefly, as we move on. So I'm going to start with in order as they presented. So Briggs, would you please start?
Just like to say thanks again to USDA, and really a big thanks to the audience. Good luck with your grant writing. We know it's a challenge, but hopefully this webinar series was useful to you. And please do let us know what your questions are. Appreciate folks engaging in the chat, and we're here to help and innovate and be helpful in any way that we can. So thank you and good luck.
Christine.
Yeah, I would also say that, if the program that you're interested in, if they provide contact information, feel free to reach out to the point of contact. You'll find that in the NOFA. Again, that very important document that I can't overstate. If you have questions, maybe they can also suggest somebody within the organization that can, provide some helpful tips or coaching or whatever for that given project, or for that particular program. I know at RD, we have staff in the field, and we have program staff that are very anxious and willing to help applicants, not prepare, but offer suggestions to help them improve, their the application that they intend to submit for that project, for that given program. Sorry. Anyway, it's not as daunting as it seems. And like Lou said, you might want to start small, with your first attempt if you've never done one before.
And Lou.
I just invite each organization to plan ahead, start getting your critical needs statements, your programs, get your files in order, get everything ready so that when that grant shows up, you are ready to pull the trigger and get started, and just have fun with it.
Okay, thank you. And if you could bring the slide deck back up, please, for the final slides. Again, if you could please bring the slide deck back up. Okay, this is what I wanted to get to. This is our final slide for today, and I just wanted to tell you the way to connect. And this is Let's Connect. And again, my name is Carol Watuski. I am a program development specialist with the Innovation Center and also the RWIN team lead. But we're interested in your comments, your suggestions. If you want any kind of follow-ups that you would like from this, please send an email to us at RWIN. You can send that email to rd.innovation.rwin@usda.gov. Recordings of these workshops, part 1 and 2, will be placed on the RWIN webpage in the future. In the meantime, last year we did a whole series around funding on specific topics like clean energy jobs, youth workforce apprenticeships, and things like that. So if you would like to view those, please visit the RWIN webpage. My piece of advice on grant writing and grant reviewing, because that's also part of my career, is start early. Lou mentioned it in the beginning. When you get it announced, print off that funding notice and start going through it and start putting things together, and do a really good start early, because a lot of times when people wait to the last minute, they miss key points, and those key items is really going to have an impact on how you score on that, because these are all competitive. But I wish everybody good luck in their opportunities. Don't hesitate to reach out to USDA Rural Development, as well as the Interagency Working Group, with questions that you may have on this and future topics. With that, I wish everyone a great afternoon. Goodbye.